Any documents to and from the committee are available for inspection by any members of the public. Now let's move to information item before the committee. They are information requested by the committee of PG&E to be presented in this public meeting. Now may I introduce Mr. Kerry Harbour, Director of Business Planning, and turn the podium over to Mr. Harbour so that he can introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So our first topic for presentation today is on the independent spent fuel storage installation. It's an update, and it'll be provided by our Director of Technical Services, Jearl Strickland. And Jearl has a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering, has an MBA degree, has over 35 years of nuclear experience, and has leadership roles in a number of areas, including engineering and project management. With that, I'll have Jearl go ahead and take us through this item.
Welcome.
Good morning. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for inviting me to come back and speak again on this topic. I think if I added them all up, this would probably be the 30th plus time that we've discussed this topic.
Who's counting?
Yeah, who's counting?
It's liable not to be the last time.
Yeah. So the intent of the presentation today is to go through and give you an update on where we are with the overall program for Diablo. To spend a little bit of time talking about activities related to the question of external corrosion of multipurpose canisters. We'll then spend a few minutes talking about the storage systems that are available here in the United States versus one of the systems that is available in Europe. And the impetus for discussing that topic a little bit is the question keeps coming up about other products that are available or could be available for use here, and that I just want to address that a little bit. And then lastly, what I'll do is I'll close on talking about some of the decommissioning considerations to be able to look at opportunities for being able to expedite movement of all fuel out of wet storage into dry storage. So as always, I like to start with an overview photo of Diablo Canyon. And so with this, you can clearly see that the power plant itself with the Unit 1, Unit 2 containments is approximately 85 feet above sea level. Just behind the two containment structures on the inland side is our fuel handling building, which houses the two spent fuel pools for Unit 1 and Unit 2. And then inland, approximately half a mile from the coast, is the independent spent fuel storage installation. And it's approximately 310 feet above sea level. This is a photo of one of our spent fuel pools. And as we've discussed many times in the past, that initially when fuel is discharged from a reactor after it's been used for approximately 3 cycles, then it's put into storage within the pools to be able to allow it to continue to discharge heat and reach a point where it becomes a candidate then to be able to be moved into dry storage. Currently, our license requires that fuel spend approximately 7 years in the pools before it becomes a candidate for dry storage. This is a photo of the dry storage system that's utilized at Diablo Canyon's power plant. That it's from Holtec International. It's the high storm system that's been modified for high seismic for our region. And the big difference with it is that our high storm system has a welded structure on the bottom of the high storm that allows it to then be anchored to a foundation system. So underneath each one of the high storms is an embedded structure within an 8-foot thick foundation that then allows us to be able to transfer any seismic forces into the foundation to provide additional levels of protection for the fuel that's stored in the facility. Diablo Canyon's the only facility that has this type of storage system.
Jearl?
Yes, sir.
The title of that thing is a multi-purpose canister. What is the other purpose?
So,
I mean, I think I know, but since it has this name, perhaps you could describe what the more than one purposes might be of the canister that's inside.
Sure, it's an overall system. And I have a slide that comes up in a few minutes that talks more about the overall system. But just to use this slide, for fuel that's stored in the United States, fuel is stored in a multi-purpose canister, whereby that canister then can be utilized for either interim storage, as in this case, or ultimately be used for transportation to a longer-term storage facility, reprocessing if we reprocessed fuel, or other treatment of that fuel. So the intent is that multi-purpose canister has multiple uses, not just simply to store the fuel in the interim storage facility.
So just to elaborate, and you can tell me if my understanding is right, the MPC object is designed so that transportation using it is available if you want to, and it's been so designed. So that's why that's the second purpose.
That's correct. So that multi-purpose canister in a storage facility like this is placed in an overpack that is comprised of 2 steel vessels with concrete in between to be able to provide shielding for that fuel. When you put it into a transportation type package or a transfer type package, then the package is smaller, weighs less. These are about 175 tons a piece, while a transfer package is about 125 tons. So, multiple uses.
Thank you.
This is an overview picture of the storage facility, and that when we originally licensed the facility, we licensed it to be able to accommodate all the fuel discharged from Diablo for the 40-year license life, but yet constructed it with just 2 out of the 7 foundations initially. And that was under the premise that we were hopeful that Yucca Mountain licensing would continue, and that in turn that we wouldn't have to fully develop the facility nor store the entire 40 years worth of fuel within the facility. With the decisions made on Yucca and no other interim facilities in sight, we went ahead and expanded the facility to the full 7 foundations, so it now has the ability to be able to store all the fuel discharged through 2025. Another shot at the facility now with the 49 casks that we have in storage. So let's talk a little bit about external corrosion. So there's been a lot of discussion on the potential for chloride-induced stress corrosion cracking on stainless steel multipurpose canisters. One point that I want to make is that there has been no stress corrosion cracking on any multipurpose canisters in the United States identified to date. And I have a document that I'll provide you at the end of this session as a reference for you to review. But having said that there is the potential for corrosion cracking in the future, and that it takes a number of mechanisms. One of it is that for the locations around welds, that you have the potential to have higher stressors, and that in turn, if you have then chloride present and then moisture present, then you have a driver that through time has the potential to be able to develop chloride-induced stress corrosion. So one of the key factors with that is that through the early life of multi-purpose canisters, the temperatures are very high, and in turn don't allow condensation to be able to develop on multi-purpose canisters to be able to allow that third layer allow chloride-induced stress corrosion cracking to start. But having said that, it is very important to continue to monitor and to be able to address the potentials for corrosion, and in turn continue to look for opportunities to be able to improve the materials that are utilized. So I'll cover this in just one second, but one point to make with that is that through time, materials have changed. The first 8 multi-purpose canisters for Diablo were A304 stainless steel. From there, the next batch was A304L, which is a lower carbon stainless steel. And today, the bulk of the multi-purpose canisters that are produced by Holtec are 316L, which again provides even less longer-term potential for chloride-induced corrosion. So the industry does continue to learn and continue to provide additional assurance, better materials through time to be able to limit potentials for stress corrosion cracking. So back in August of 2016, EPRI published a report that looked at the overall current conditions of multi-purpose canisters, not only at Diablo but in other places. The point here is that PG&E's Diablo Canyon volunteered to be part of this study to be able to look at what are the potentials for corrosion in coastal sites such as ours. So with that, one of the points that was noted was some of the initial canister material lots are more susceptible. So that was the point with the A304 stainless steel that's now progressed. We're using A316L stainless steel. They also noted that there's insufficient chloride concentration to initiate corrosion, that through the inspections they did identify that there were a number of chloride crystals that had formed on the exterior of a multi-purpose canister, but yet that there was insufficient quantities to be able to have that be an issue at this point. And that in the end, that there were no corrosion found during this inspection. Since that point in time, EPRI has gone through and developed and published an aging management guidance program that was issued a little bit earlier this year. I've brought a copy for you guys that I'll leave with you. That it goes through and provides a very detailed set of proposed requirements to be able to utilize for controlling an aging management program for the longer term. And that it's currently under review for implementation, and that our intent is to utilize this going forward as guidance for how we'll implement an aging management program. Yes, sir.
A typical process with EPRI studies like that is that they, not always, but typically would submit it to the NRC that might endorse it, in which case then everybody with these systems can use it in their license regulatory work. I assume that's probably what's going on.
That's correct.
And that it's only just March, so the NRC probably hasn't come to the endorsement step yet, but they're probably working on it. I'm just guessing, but I think that's probably right.
That's my understanding from the aspects of what you look at our Humboldt Bay ISFAC, that we're going through the relicensing process for that facility, and as such that there's a lot of the insight and input from this aging management program that the NRC has essentially recommended that we incorporate that as part of our license application for how we'll continue to manage that facility in the future.
Yeah, I mean, a typical thing, members of the public ought to understand, a typical thing is the NRC might endorse this as one possible way of meeting their regulatory requirements. And then if they have and you decide to use it, then you don't have to have it reviewed again. You just have to make sure you're doing it, as opposed to reviewing the content of it once they've endorsed it. And that's an efficient way for them to do it for everybody.
Yes.
And what are some of the highlights and key aspects of an aging management program under that document?
Well, it really gets into inspection protocols, and that the robotic inspection techniques that are coming forth are advancing very quickly. So the tooling, the types of inspections, and then the frequency of inspections are covered into this. And that as you go through the license renewal process, then it will be placed as a requirement for how you implement that aging management. SFC licensing is different than a power plant licensing, in that in a nuclear power plant, the initial license is for 40 years. For a ISFC, it's 20 years, and then the relicense is for a 40-year period. So that means that our license for Diablo Canyon expires in 2024 for the ISFC, and it's and it's going to be important to be able to start that relicensing process soon. Yes, sir.
I heard a short briefing about this new EPRI thing a year ago, and I recall, you can correct me if, they were considering in the aging management guidance not only, well, let me say, they have in there a a method for inspections, for inspections, which if the NRC endorses, you can use that method.
Correct. Right?
But they also have in there a series of proposals. If the inspection finds something that isn't exactly perfect, then there's some degradation that's faster than what they would hope. Then there's some remedial actions that are then recommended that would slow it down or stop the process. And at the time, I remember this briefing, it was about a year, I can't remember what it was, 9 months ago or something. They weren't sure whether that second piece of it was going to be in this guidance. So I haven't seen it, but I assume it probably is.
It is.
And then again, if NRC endorses that, then you could invoke those remedial measures if you needed over the years if the inspections found something.
Correct. And that's the intent with having a very detailed aging management program guidance such as this.
Yeah, and then the other thing, remind me, you'll tell me, was that EPRI was talking about having a group that they would organize or, bring into being of plant experts who would go around and be available to provide consultation or even assistance to a plant that needed some assistance, industry group.
And that I'm not aware of as far as a formal group, but I know that already as part of the Holtec users group.
So it might not have been a formal group that I remember. I'm just trying to remember. It wasn't clear.
But Holtec users group is formed and provides assistance across the various users.
So that's the sort of thing where if another station had an issue and you knew something about it, Diablo would help them and vice versa.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Just for clarification, the term EPRI or EPRI is the Electric Power Research Institute, which is the research arm of the electric power industry. You may have said that, but I didn't catch it.
I didn't, thank you.
Electric power, the R in EPRI is research.
It's one of the curses of the nuclear industry. We get so hung up on acronyms at times that we forget to explain what they mean. Okay. And so going forward, that there are a number of different committees that we have members of our staff involved with, and that this just highlights that we're actively participating, and that we want to make sure that as additional lessons learned are identified, that we're part of that, and in turn have the ability to be able to leverage those to the overall safe operation of our facility. So let's talk about storage systems a little bit. So in the United States, there are three major vendors, and one is Holtec International that we use. Arriva's Transnuclear with their new homes is the other, and then NAC continues to play a role, but in a smaller capacity than the other two. In Europe, there's one storage system that I want to just spend a few minutes talking about because I've heard it referenced many times, which is the GNS Castor system. So Holtec, the system that's utilized at Humboldt Bay and in turn is really established more as a storage and transportation type cask is the High Star. And the big difference with this is that it's constructed very similar to our High Storms in that it has two steel vessels that are each an inch thick, but that interstitial space between the vessels is filled with lead instead of concrete. So as a result, you're able to have a smaller package and a lighter package than the large concrete structures. With this, it also uses the multi-purpose canister that is a welded enclosure, and in turn then has the bottom and top lids that are bolted in place. And then the High Storm overpack that in turn is again two steel vessels an inch thick and has approximately 26 inches of high density concrete in between to act as the shielding. Now these are so large and so heavy that they don't lend themselves to be able to be transported, and so that's why in turn you would utilize either a High Star storage container to be able to move that multi-purpose canister into it for shipment, or any other transportation container that was designed and licensed by Holtec to be able to use that. Let's go to the next. So then the Castor system, that it is very different than the way that we store fuel on an interim basis in the United States, in that they don't utilize a multi-purpose canister, that they have essentially a monolithic cast iron vessel that is approximately 9 inches thick, that and in turn has a bolted lid closure, actually two lids that they put on it. And the development of these were really under the premise that they do a lot of reprocessing. So you'll put fuel into these storage containers for a finite period of time before you're then ready to be able to remove it, reprocess it, and then reuse the containers. So it's a different philosophy, and in turn, this system is not licensed for use in the United States.
General question.
Yes, sir.
The High Star system, is the overpack simply for transportation, or if they had an ultimate disposal site, would it stay with the multi-purpose canister?
You have the ability for it to stay with the multi-purpose canister, and that with Humboldt Bay facility, we elected when we designed that facility to be able to simply purchase the High Star storage overpacks to be able to then remove the fuel and transport it in those containers. And the basis for that was that with us decommissioning the plant, removing spent fuel pools, not having a cask transfer facility up there, that it made sense, especially with only 5 multi-purpose canisters, to be able to use the High Star system and in turn be able to take that package out, put energy absorbers on it, and transport them off-site. Doesn't make sense for the Diablo SVC.
Okay, another question. When you transport the multi-purpose canister from the spent fuel pool up to the SVC, do you use an overpack during the transfer?
No, we use a transfer cask, and so in essence that transfer cask is very similar to the High Star, to where it's 2 steel vessels, lead in between the vessels, and then on top of that then we have another vessel on the outside that acts as a void to be able to fill with water. So we use water then as additional shielding to protect the workers as we're then transporting. And so You transport the fuel from our fuel handling building in that transfer cask up to a cask transfer facility that's just outside our storage facility, and then facilitate a transfer of that multi-purpose canister through the transfer cask, through a mating device into the storage overpack.
Okay, thank you.
You only do those one at a time, so you only need one of those.
That's correct. So you need, and that'll be a consideration for decommissioning as to whether or not we procure the second one,
another one,
so that you could then be loading both Unit 1 and Unit 2 pools at the same time.
Understand.
For movement to dry cask storage. So let's talk about decommissioning considerations for a few minutes. So as you know, there's a joint proposal agreement that requires us to look at how do we optimize the amount of time that fuel is in the wet storage. And so in addition to that, as part of the nuclear decommissioning funding, that we've also been asked to look at how do you optimize the current assumptions and be able to reduce the amount of time that fuel is in wet storage. So in order to do that, the initial studies that we're currently performing show that you really need to save some of your older fuel, so that for the last couple of cycles of operation, the fuel that's discharged, that is hotter, that you need to be able to have some older fuel to be able to mix within that multi-purpose canister to use what's called regionalized storage, to be able to then offload that fuel from the pools sooner rather than later. So what this graph does is it shows current plans in that we are at essentially minimums within the pools today, and that after this last refueling outage, we're planning on doing another loading campaign next summer where we'll load 8 casks. But the question then comes into, if we continue with the current plans of doing 2 additional loading campaigns, that in order to be able to have the last discharged fuel cool to the point where you can offload all of it into dry cask storage, we're looking at a timeline that puts us out to approximately 2033, 2034 timeframe. And so the 2 studies that we're performing right now, one with Holtec, one with Transnuclear, is looking at what does it really take to be able to reduce that window down to as short a period as possible. And that what we're finding for the preliminary results is that if we delay moving fuel out of the pool, that we can shorten that window down to the range of 4 to 5 years instead of 7 to 9 years. And so with that, as the studies finish, we'll have to make some decisions internally as to how many additional loading campaigns we do after next summers to be able to then do the appropriate planning for decommissioning, shorten that window down, which then in turn, once you have all the fuel out of the spent fuel pools, then that allows you to be able to accelerate decommissioning activities.
One of the key issues as you transition into decommissioning is there's a certain point where you take irreversible actions that make it impossible to use the spent fuel pool. And at that point, the option of being able to inspect things inside of canisters on site becomes much more difficult because you no longer have a facility that's capable of doing that. The risk, I think, that you would need to actually reopen a canister for any reason is fairly small, but it's not zero, and therefore that decision to essentially lose or remove the capability to reopen canisters on site is a significant one in the timing of that decision as well. Is there a way to factor that into this overall set of questions about how rapidly one should offload fuel and what the staging should be in terms of the decommissioning?
Yeah, I think that's always part of the discussion that will be involved in the decision-making process. And in addition to that, it'll be, how quickly does DOE and companies like Holtec proceed with interim storage facilities, regionalized interim storage facilities?
Correct.
That if you end up with a facility in the next 10 years that has the ability to be able to start taking fuel from San Onofre, Rancho Seco, Humboldt Bay, Diablo, then in turn, then you have the options there for being able to reopen a multi-purpose canister and do any inspections or any other treatment as appropriate.
That's a very good point, and perhaps it makes it worthwhile to emphasize further. The realistic options for having consolidated storage involve the two applications that are currently at the NRC, one of which has been put on hold due to lack of availability of funding, and both of which face significant uncertainty because there's no current statutory authority for the DOE to use that capability even if it were to become available. I think that when one looks at frankly, the risks that are associated with completing decommissioning and leaving spent fuel on site, and the irreversible action of shutting down the spent fuel pool capability, that it would be prudent to move the fuel to consolidated storage earlier so that you don't have to worry about that risk.
I agree with you, and that's where I think it's fortunate that you have strong senators such as Dianne Feinstein that are becoming very active in this discussion now, and that in turn, hopefully that will help move the needle on consolidated interim storage.
Right. The key issue, though, is that I don't think we're going to see significant private sector investment to get these consolidated storage facilities sited and licensed, at least for the Texas site, unless there's some congressional action to pass some type of statutory language that essentially confirms that if it were to become available, the DOE would use it. And moreover, that they would prioritize taking spent fuel from decommissioned reactors.
Right.
Because there's an obvious set of arguments. I'm pretty sure that the best thing for ratepayers is that you initiate the decommissioning activities very early on. And I think once you stop the use of and shut down salt water, that's pretty much it for being able to use your spent fuel pool. Maybe it would,
unless you bring in package heat exchangers.
So overall, it would be very nice. This is a window of time which is plenty long in a technical sense to complete the licensing review and initiate transfers of spent fuel, particularly away from coastal sites like Diablo Canyon, Songs, and Humboldt Bay.
I agree.
But I have to say that the ability to put that language into appropriations bills or into separate bills has existed for several years, and unless Congress does something, I'm very pessimistic.
Is it correct to say, Jearl, that if fuel has to stay in the spent fuel pool 7 years before you transport it, and your last fuel assembly would be out in 2025, the earliest you could complete shipping the fuel to the dry storage would be 2032?
That's
in sort of in simplistic terms.
Yes. Although it takes you time to package,
right,
and move it.
Is there any way to shorten that 7-year period? Is that reasonable or not reasonable?
It's from the studies that we're currently performing. It is reasonable, but it takes having older fuel available to be able to mix.
Oh, like you were talking about earlier. Okay, thanks.
Yes, sir.
So far, correct me if I'm wrong, so far all of the fuel transferred from the pools up to the IFC has been assemblies that are intact, and you haven't done any, you have some assemblies from the old days where some of the fuel had failed, right? And is that right?
No, Diablo is very fortunate in that
You have a remarkably good fuel performance, by the way. Good
in that we don't have any fuel that we have to consider as failed fuel, and to be able to put in a separate failed fuel container.
That's what I was going to ask. I know that there's some from the old days in there that where you had some failures, but my recollection, what you just confirmed, was that nothing is there that has a severe enough problem that you'd have to have a special overpack before it went in to go in. And is that continues to be the case?
That continues to be the case.
Okay, so unless a misfortune brings about some important fuel failures in the next few years, you're not going to have to face any of that interim step.
That's correct. And our license for our facility and then for the multi-purpose canisters allows you to have a number of failed fuel assemblies to where there are 4 locations in each one of the multi-purpose canisters that you can then take a separate container, put the fuel assembly in that separate container, seal it, and then put it inside the multi-purpose.
But that provision has not been required to date, and your expectation is it will never be unless there's some change.
Correct.
Okay.
And Mr. Strickland, in that context, currently this facility has the capability to reopen a cask?
Yes. That was part of the licensing requirements for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
You demonstrated
to reopen the cask.
Yes,
absolutely.
We had to demonstrate that as part of our initial dry runs for operation to be able to show that our process procedures allowed us to do that.
And the capability to do that will be retained up until the spent fuel pool is shut down.
Correct.
But with what you just described, with encapsulation, there's no need to reopen the cask. If you can re-encapsulate it.
It hasn't been so far.
No, I mean, why?
There shouldn't be any reason that you would need to reopen the cask, but
Right. Let's say there is some failure inside the cask. All you need to do is encapsulate it into another one.
That we don't have a process that's licensed for that at this point. But in turn, that's something that would have to be addressed at that point.
I see. And also, when you talk about optimization effort, so the benefit I can gather from your presentation is about 4 to 5 years shortening of the time in wet storage. Did I get that impression correctly?
Approximately. That we're going through that process right now, trying to finalize the details of the analysis to be able to see how short we can make that window.
Would you provide some context as to how significant is that 4 to 5 year shortening of the time? Is it something worthy of doing, and how much resources does it take to achieve that objective?
So my personal opinion is that it is very worthwhile from the aspect of that even though both systems are safe for wet and dry storage, it moves the fuel from the wet to the dry, and then gives you the ability to be able to stop operation of Vox salt water, to be able to not rely on heat exchangers and other processes to be able to remove heat from that pool and from the fuel assemblies. So it provides a good mechanism for continued interim storage of that fuel. And then in addition, if you start looking at overall cost for decommissioning, that the longer that you have fuel in the pool,
time is money.
The more of a delay in a lot of the decommissioning activities, and the longer you have to maintain vital areas around vital equipment such as salt water to protect that fuel pool. So by being able to shorten that window, you shorten your overall decommissioning, you reduce overall decommissioning cost, and that to me it's a great benefit for customers like myself.
I mean,
also, you may reduce the risk exposure of the plant by switching to an actively cooling system to a passively cool system.
Correct.
Well, I mean, time is money, but time is also risk, right?
Correct.
I mean, when you said, and I'm not going to argue this, that both systems are safe, but no doubt the IFC is safer than the pools. It's safer, even though both systems are safe, and so of course we want to do what's safer, all things being equal, but it isn't even equal because there's money to be saved as well, right?
Yeah.
Correct.
No, money and time, right?
I think that the
So it's
key,
all pushes in the same direction.
the key set of assumptions is that the Holtec canisters can be used for transportation. They're licensed for that purpose, but it's not been demonstrated. And it's very likely that they will be able to be used for transportation, but if any issue were to emerge with the canisters, the ability to correct that problem becomes more limited if you don't have a spent fuel pool. So better to move them, start moving them while you still have an operational spent fuel pool, so you can confirm that the whole transportation process can be executed. Because we've not done that with these canisters, I think.
They've done a lot of testing, including the rail car incident and so forth.
Yeah, that wasn't a Holtec canister.
Okay.
That was a much smaller transport canister, because there is a scenario where you conclude that you'd just like to have smaller transport canisters to do the transportation, and that would require repackaging at the site that you're shipping from. These are big objects, right?
That's 125-ton transportation package. It's a big package.
Yep. And if you package them into smaller ones, that would change the logistics for the transportation. So I think it's very important for us to push really hard to move towards centralized storage for the spent fuel.
I agree with you.